Nikki Lowe, and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show, where I share insights and interviews that support women to combine their family, work and life in a more successful and sustainable way. Welcome to this episode. I'm your host, Nikki Lowe, and today I'm talking about burnout. The last year has been really intense for so many of us working mums. It's left us feeling perhaps overwhelmed and exhausted. We've been carrying the mental and emotional load now for a long time. And I think a lot of us are feeling that kind of full up but empty feeling, full up of so many emotions, but kind of empty in our energy tanks. And this episode is for you if you know that the last year has taken its toll on your well-being and you're concerned that you might be on the road to burnout. I wanted to do this episode because I'm seeing far too many powerhouse of women with their light slowly dimming out. The pandemic has really impacted working mums significantly, and I'm genuinely concerned about the impact of burnout on us. So in this episode, I'm talking about what is burnout, how to recognise the signs of it, and what to do if you're noticing that you're heading towards, or perhaps you're already in burnout. But before we dive in, I'd like to do a listener shout out, and I'd like to thank you, Chloe's Mum 14 from America, who left this review on Apple Podcasts. And she said, comforting and inspiring. I'm not typically a podcast fan. Who has the time for podcasts? But I attended Nikki's burnout prevention workshop, and it helped me realise that I was dangerously close to burnout. I've since introduced a 30-minute walk or jog to my day for the benefit of my mind and body, so it's a perfect time to listen to Nikki's podcast and have some me time. It's comforting to know that others are going through the same challenges, and I learned some great tips on how to take care of myself so I can show up for others, be more positive and balance work life and mum life. Thank you, Nikki. Well, no, thank you, Chloe's Mum 14. I am firstly so happy that the masterclass helped you and it helped you realise how close to burnout that you were and that you've taken action to support you. And it means the world that you're using that precious time for you to listen to this podcast. So thank you. And I've said it before, and it can feel like I'm in a vacuum in this podcast land. I often don't know who's listening and what impact the episodes are having. So if you're listening to this and you've not yet left a review, it would be amazing if you did. You can head over to iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast, rate the podcast and leave a review there. Not only does it help me to continue to develop really useful and relevant episodes for you, but it also helps another working mum like you to benefit from the show, because the more reviews the podcast gets, the higher in the rankings it gets, and so more people get to see it. Kind of that's how it works. So if you've not yet done that, please do. So now back to banishing burnout. The reason that I'm so passionate about this subject, and the whole reason I started Wisdom for Working Mums, is because of my own experience with burnout. And it was 8 years ago now, and I was pregnant with my first child. And I really thought I was in a great position to become a mother. My career was thriving. I'd become one of the top exec coaches in the UK. And my work was taking me around the world. And I was working with some of the world's largest organisations, supporting really their executives to thrive personally and professionally. And my reputation was strong, so I felt that I could take a career break and my business could sustain kind of me being off on maternity leave. And I felt physically really healthy and mentally just in a really strong and great place. So I was totally unprepared when during that first year of motherhood, everything started to spiral out of control. About 6 months after having my son, I just felt physically exhausted. But I kind of just put it down to being a new mum, even though by this point I was really lucky. He was sleeping through the night consistently. My daughter didn't, but he did. But I just started to get unwell and I started to catch every cold going. And that's despite up to that point, I had a really strong immune system. I never really got colds, but I just got cold after cold after cold. And then it kind of started to develop into more sinister symptoms. And I remember going to the doctors and just saying, look, something's not right. And they did loads of tests on me and they were like, no, you're fine. Everything's normal. You're just a new mum. New mums are tired. And so I just assumed that was the case and carried on. But I started again to get more and more ill. And it got to the point where every cell in my body felt unwell and I knew something wasn't right. So I went back to the doctors and had more tests and again was told, no, everything's fine. You're just a new mum. And I think what no one had looked at, including me, was what were the dots that were joining for me to get there. And, you know, if I look back, although I was in a great place, or I felt to have my first child, I totally anticipated the impact that being pregnant and then giving birth would have on my body. I then really hadn't got my own mum around. She died quite a few years before I had children. So I hadn't got that kind of maternal line to lean into. And I had got very few women in my family around me to support me. Also, my son was born with a hole in his heart and we were in and out of hospital in those first few months of his life. And when he was about 12 weeks old, he was approved for open heart surgery and, you know, we were blue lighted to hospital at one point. So that first year, and particularly those first kind of few months of becoming a new mum, I was under incredible stress and pressure. But like most mums, you know, you just have to get on with it. So I just kind of pushed it down and just dug deep and carried on. And, you know, as mums do that, and we're really good at doing that. But it was only when I got so ill that I assumed that I'd got a rare cancer that nobody could identify, that I decided to take matters into my own hands. And I contacted an amazing lady called Jo Gamble from a company called Embracing Nutrition, who's one of the UK's top functional medicine practitioners. And if you've not listened yet to episode 15, I interviewed Jo and we talk about my story and what she does. And Jo was instrumental in getting me back to full health. She was the one that suspected that I'd got adrenal fatigue, and we did tests and discovered, yes, I had in fact burnt myself out and burnt my adrenal system out. And I remember her giving me that diagnosis and just crying with relief that I could understand what was going on, because I genuinely thought something was much more serious than that. As serious as it was, I thought I'd got kind of a life-limiting illness that nobody knew about, because I genuinely felt that ill. Jo supported me on that journey back to full health, and it was quite a long one, but an incredibly powerful one. And I call it my kind of breakdown to breakthrough, because it made me reassess my life. It made me look at so many different aspects of my life, and was what really inspired me to start Wisdom for Working Mums, because I realised that if I'd struggled with this, with all the resources that I had as a coach, you know, with my psychological training, my leadership training, and, you know, and the people that I had around me, how were other women doing it? So I made it kind of my mission to want to share that learning with people like yourself, so that nobody ever has to go on that kind of journey. And I think it's worth just thinking about the context about how we become mums, because we're told that giving birth is one of the most natural things you can do. And as a result, I completely underestimated it. I assumed, you know, all women do it and they do it with such relative ease, I thought at the time, that actually I'll be fine. But our modern culture isn't set up to support women through this incredible life transition. You know, for many of us, and I was this type of person, you know, I had already depleted myself in my career before I even got pregnant. You know, I pushed myself to my limits. I was an overachiever. And actually, before having children, there was time for recovery. So for weekends, I could rest. You know, when I went on holiday, I could truly rest. So I was masking the fact that I'd already probably depleted my system. But then if you take pregnancy, actually what we do when we're pregnant to create life in itself is depleting. And I discovered a book called Postnatal Depletion by an incredible guy called Dr. Oscar Selarak. And he talks about this concept of postnatal depletion. And he says it's a constellation of symptoms affecting all spheres of a mother's life after she gives birth. And these symptoms arise from physiological issues, hormone changes, and the interruption of the circadian rhythm, layered with psychological, mental, and emotional components. And I think I totally underestimated actually being pregnant and the resources that takes physically. And then that first trimester after giving birth, they talk about it being the fourth trimester. And in ancient times, women would have been totally cared for as well as the baby in that fourth trimester. But actually, the common culture that we have now, the modern culture, is all about bouncing back. And we see, all of these amazing women in media that just seem to naturally bounce back from giving birth. But I think that's such a rare experience, but we kind of think it's the norm, and that if we're not, there's something wrong with us. And I think if you also layer in the fact that, Glennon Doyle talks about this in her book Untamed, that women have martyred themselves in the name of motherhood since the beginning of time. And our species has survived because that women have done that. We care for our offspring because they are so vulnerable. But I think in the modern era, that's really no longer sustainable, because we haven't got that village around us like we used to have, where, we would have the grandmothers and the great-grandmothers and the aunts all living in literally the same house or village and supporting that new mother. And then if you add into that most women are now what Eve Rodsky talks about being the she-fault parent, where we carry the domestic load, the emotional load, and the second shift, because, even the most up-to-date research indicates that women still do the bulk of the childcare and domestic work, even in two-income households. And Eve Rodsky, and if you've not listened to my conversation with her in episode 45, I would really recommend you do that, because she talks about, it's the same shit but a different decade, that actually, as women, we are shouldering so much if we're working mums. And then you add in a pandemic, and it's kind of trying to make an impossible puzzle fit together, parenting and working simultaneously, and feeling the pressure to fit in our paid work and our non-paid work obligations into a day, and there just aren't enough hours to do that, and the inner conflict that creates for us, and the stress is just heartbreaking, and particularly some of the stories I'm hearing at the moment. So it's little wonder that we're now really, really tired. So what is burnout? Well, it's a term that was first coined in 1975 by a gentleman called Herbert Freudenberger. And he really identified three components to burnout. He said it was emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a decreased sense of accomplishment. So the emotional exhaustion kind of speaks for itself. But the depersonalization really is about when our empathy and our caring and our compassion gets depleted because we just are at our limits. And that decreased sense of accomplishment is that, even no matter how fast you keep your feet moving, you don't feel that you're moving forward. And in May 2019, the World Health Organization actually included burnout in their 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases. So they call it the ICD-11, and they included burnout in that classification. And they said it was an occupational phenomenon. So it's not classified as a medical condition, but they said that burnout is a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And they said it was characterised by three dimensions. They talk about feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion. It's about increased mental distance from one job or feelings of negative or cynicism relating to the job, and reduced professional efficacy. So very similar to what Herbert Freudenberger said. But interestingly, they specifically say that burnout refers to the phenomena in the occupational context and should not be applied to describe experiences in other areas of life. But I have a real problem with that, because actually my own experience of burnout wasn't a professional one. It's not to say I wasn't near to it before, but my actual burnout wasn't caused by a professional context. And so I personally have a real issue with that, because it feels like it's a definition that's come from men, because when you think about it, both men and women experience burnout, but actually gender shapes the environmental and individual pathways to burnout. And I believe if women were looking at this, we would go, absolutely, motherhood is a significant risk for burnout. So actually, there is research, Harris Poll in 2019 said that women may burn out faster than men. And I think that's influenced really by our biochemistry. I think there's something about the hormonal and particularly the physical demand of motherhood, but also our beliefs about who we should be. And I think culturally we have a lot of pressure on ourselves about the expectations around motherhood and about kind of doing it all. And I recently read a book called The Patriarchy Stress Disorder by a lady called Dr. Valerie Rain. She talks about, in years gone by, they used to burn women at the stakes, but now they just hand us the torches and we burn ourselves out, because so many of us are trying to succeed in a male paradigm that just isn't helpful for our female bodies. And that's not our fault. It is completely not our fault. But if we want to stop the risk of burning out, we have to take responsibility for what's going on. And it's recognising that our autonomic nervous system is designed to deal with stress. And autonomic nervous system is really our involuntary response to it. And it's designed to wave between stress, so our fight and flight system, which is our sympathetic nervous system, and the rest and digest, which is kind of the parasympathetic system. And they're designed to work in a complementary way, in kind of this wave that we perceive a threat. Resources are sent to our extremities to run away, so our kind of fight or flight. And once that threat has disappeared, those resources are restored to relax the body, and our kind of heart rate slows down, and we're able to stimulate our digestion again, hence the rest and digest. And our resilience zone is where kind of our autonomic nervous system is designed to operate in. But particularly over the last year, most of us will be working outside of our resilience zone because it's been extended. We've been operating outside of that zone for too long. And that has consequences, and, sometimes significant consequences. We either become overcharged, so we go above our resilience zone and we get stuck in this stress response, become kind of hypervigilant or hyper-aroused, or we become undercharged, where we drop to the bottom and become hypo-aroused and kind of collapse. And if we're in either that overcharged or undercharged, just know our brains are doing what they're designed to do. Our species didn't survive because we had these super sharp teeth or claws or a strong shell, but we developed this super sensitive brain that scanned our environment for potential threats. And if it perceived one, it would trigger that stress response. So our brain is doing what it's designed to do. But there's a difference between stressors and stress, because burnout is about being stuck in a situation that you're constantly being exposed to stress without the resources to effectively deal with it. And I think actually that is a beautiful definition of what's been going on in this pandemic, because we are stuck in a situation which we have little control over, and we're being exposed to the stress that creates without the resources to deal with it. So stresses are what activate the stress response in our body. And they can be anything that we could see, hear, smell, touch, taste, or even imagine can do us harm. And they can be external or internal. And man, are we swimming in a sea of potential stresses at the moment. So the stresses are almost the either real or imagined, external or internal kind of trigger. And stress is the neurobiological neurobiological or the physiological shift that happens in our body in response to those perceived threats. And it's, as I said earlier, it's our evolutionary adaptive process. And it's a kind of cascade of these neurobiological, neurological and hormonal activity that create physiological changes in our body to help us survive. So it's where our blood flow is sent to our extremities, so our hands and our legs and our feet, to either run away or fight it. And the energy is taken away from our vital organs, because in that moment, it's an evolutionary process of running away from a saber-toothed tiger. But for most of us, the threats that we're perceiving in our modern world aren't life or death, but our bodies are kind of hardwired to respond in that way. So stress has far-reaching consequences on our body. And really, there are three factors that create stress. There's uncertainty, there's lack of information, and lack of control. So uncertainty, lack of information, and loss of control. And if you think about it, motherhood has those three components: uncertainty, lack of information, and loss of control. But then mothering in a pandemic. So it's no wonder we're feeling under stress. But being stressed isn't bad. But being stuck in a stress response without completing it is what's bad. So if you've spent the last kind of 6, 12 months or maybe more accumulating incomplete stress cycles, that's what can create the problem here for burnout. So acute stress is okay. It's the chronic stress that is more of a problem. So acute stress is, when we have those moments of kind of delivering an important presentation or a stressful conversation. Those are acute stress. Chronic stress is when it's long term. And Dr. Gabor Mate, who wrote a brilliant book called The Body Says No, he talks about chronic stress is activation of the stress mechanism over long periods of time, where a person is exposed to stresses that cannot be escaped, either because she does not recognise them or because she has no control over them. And I think that's where I was 8 years ago. I think some of it I didn't have control over. Newborn baby, and then discovering that he got a hole in his heart. I'd got no control over it. So what do you do with that stress? You've just got to I thought the only option I'd got was to suck it up and get on with it. But also, I wasn't really recognising the stress. I'm actually really good at dealing with big stress. It's little kind of daily stresses I'm not very good at handling. So I didn't even recognise how stressed I was. And everybody was like, oh my God, you're coping with this really well. And I was disconnected from the stress. I genuinely thought I was coping with it well. So how would you recognise then if you're in these signs of burnout? Well, it can be like a complex web, and I'm not a doctor or a health professional. I'm just really talking from my own personal experience and what I've learned over my own journey. So yeah, it's a complex web of physical, emotional and mental kind of symptoms. And there's a kind of classification now in the medical profession called psychoneuroimmunology. And it's a relatively new field of study that looks at the interactions between your central nervous system and your immune system. And researchers now know that our central nervous system and our immune system can communicate with each other. But they only really started to understand how they do this and what it means. So it's relatively new. So actually the symptoms in isolation can seem minor, but when you put that picture together, you can start to see what's going on. So what I wanted to share with you was really 5 red flags that might indicate that you're on the road to burnout. And I just want you to reflect on them and just see how many of them you can identify with. So the first red flag is feeling very tired upon waking. And that's despite getting a good night's sleep. And so there's a difference. So I can tell the difference between I'm tired because I've had a bad night's sleep and I'm on the way to burnout. It's kind of like tiredness in every cell of your body rather than that head tired. And the only way that I could describe it when I was feeling ill to people was it was almost like plugging your mobile phone into charge overnight. but waking up in the morning and it's not charged properly because there's a loose connection. And that was my experience. I was getting good night's sleep because, as I say, at that point, my son was sleeping through the night, but I was waking up feeling exhausted. Another red flag is the inability to handle stress. So it's kind of like you're sweating the small stuff, you're hyper aroused and outside of your resilience zones. Everything's triggering a stress response. Another red flag is that you're more prone to illness and your recovery time is longer than usual. So as I say, my first sign that I was burning out was I kept getting cold after cold after cold. I'd recover from one and catch another one. And that was really unusual for me. And then that developed for me to pick up other illnesses that were going around and led to other physical issues. And I just couldn't recover. So that was a sign that my immune system was really compromised. Another red flag is brain fog. So you're struggling to concentrate and you're losing your train of thought easily. Now, I personally didn't have that as an experience with burnout, but it's one that is commonly talked about. And then the fifth sign is you've just lost your mojo. You're kind of struggling to enjoy life for no apparent reason. And I found there was a huge amount of guilt and shame that came for me with that experience. Like, I should just be grateful I've had a child, I should be lucky with my lot, but I just lost my mojo. And I think the issue with this is that these symptoms can be difficult to really identify because of the analogy of the boiling frog. And I don't know if you've come across this. It's not the most kind of metaphor to use, but it's a powerful one. So the case of the boiling frog is that if you took a frog and dropped it into boiling water, it would jump out the pan. But if you take a frog and drop it into cold water and slowly bring that water up to the boil, the frog won't notice and it won't jump out, and unfortunately it will get boiled to death. And I think that is a really useful analogy to think about in terms of our stress. Well, there are chronic daily stresses in our lives that are kind of more insidious and harmful because of their long-term biological consequences. And if these have crept upon us gradually, we don't even notice them. So both animals and people can experience stress with no awareness of its presence. And it's almost that if we stepped out of our life and then came back into it, we'd notice it. But because it's crept up on us so gradually, we just don't notice. So what can we do if we're experiencing burnout or feel that we could be on the road to it? I think the first thing to say is there's no band-aid for burnout. There's no pharmaceutical drug that you can take. It's a lot more complicated than that. So what can we do? I think the first thing to say is stress is not the problem. The problem is that the strategies that we use to deal with the stressors aren't the strategies that we need to deal with the actual stress reaction in our body. To be well, it's not about living in a perpetual state of safety and calm, but it's actually being able to fluidly move between the adventure, excitement, risk, and kind of stress, back to safety and calm, and then again into that adventure, excitement, risk, stress, and back to the calm and safety. But most of us live a little away from our bodies and don't listen to the signals that we need to actually move back into safety. If we assume that life as a working mum at the moment is about accumulating stress with little opportunity to complete the stress cycle, we have to look for the opportunities to reset. So what do I mean by that? Well, I like to think of stress like limescale. It can build up in our system, a bit like limescale building up in a washing machine. And I think about that advert, washing machine lasts longer with Calgol. Whether they do or not, I don't know. But I like to use that as a metaphor. So if we've got limescale building up in our system, what are we doing on a regular basis to protect ourselves from the build-up of that stress in our systems? What do we need? And often when I ask my clients that question, what do you need? What needs do you have? They don't know. They can't answer it. And they feel kind of a bit weird about that. But I think it's remembering that we forgot what we need when we learnt to please. Most of us have learnt to please, perform, perfect. And we lose touch with what our needs are. And our needs are kind of fundamental. Our needs are our things that help us feel grounded and well. And without them, we feel irritable and depleted and even unhealthy, unsafe and unwell. So your needs are different to your wants and desires. Your needs are about necessity, what is necessary for you to be able to function and be able to perform all the roles you have in your life. They're the things that help you feel kind of centered and powerful and well. Your wants and desires are the things that you might like and enjoy, but without them, they won't cause you any discomfort or concern. But your needs are unique to you and they shouldn't be compared or judged against anyone else. So, for example, for you, a need might be to have a massage because you have a bad back or it calms your nervous system and prevents you having anxiety problems. For somebody else, a massage might be kind of, I want it and I desire it, but I don't need it. So I think it's remembering that we live in a culture that doesn't encourage us or reward us for recognising and meeting our needs. Particularly as mums, we can believe that we need to sacrifice our own needs to be a good mum. So the first step in this is just acknowledging that you are a human being that has needs, and these simple requirements are needed for you to function in the world. It doesn't make you needy or weak. It means that you're recognising that you're a human being, and it allows you to be more powerful and have a greater impact in your life. So I would be getting you thinking about your different types of needs. So we have physical needs, and they're really obvious. They're things like sleep and food and water and movement and shelter and the need to feel safe. Then we'll have psychological needs. So it might be the need for alone time, to have a sense of accomplishment, need for certainty or variety or personal growth. Then there's relationship needs. So these are the needs really for connection, physical and emotional connection with others. So it might be time with your children, time with your friends, time with your loved ones, intimate time. And then the spiritual needs. So the need for time in nature or to connect with your purpose and meaning, time to connect with your religion if you have one. And our needs are both static and replenishable. So, for example, the need for shelter is static. We always need that. But other needs, we need on kind of a regular basis. And that might be daily or weekly or monthly. But when we give from a place when our own needs aren't being met, we become depleted. So we're in sacrifice. And that is not a sustainable place to give from. And I think most of us in this pandemic are giving out to our loved ones, giving out to our jobs, but we're not getting the chance to replenish. So I want you to think about what are some of the micro steps that you can take that are almost too small to fail. Just like brushing your teeth, it's such a small step that most of us remember to do it twice a day. It's kind of too small to fail. I want you to think about what are some of the things you can do that signal safety to your nervous system. And these might be things like movement, because movement tells your brain you've successfully survived the threat and your body's now safe. And I'm not just talking about exercise here, because there's a difference between working out and working in. If you're depleted already, think about working in rather than working out. And if you want to learn a bit more about that, go back and listen to episode 16 of the podcast, Rethinking Women's Health with Beth Gardner, because she's the woman that taught me about this, and she's the woman that really helped me with my recovery as well. So it might be that you go for a gentle walk, or you do some gentle stretching, or you might even put some music on and shake it out. And what I mean by that is if you watch animals in the wild, like a deer that's been chased by a tiger, if it survives, it will take itself off into the bush and you will see it shake itself. And what it's doing is expelling the stress hormones from its system through its extremities. So actually, as a species, we are part of Mother Nature. We're designed to do that. We're designed to expel our energy, but most of us don't. We're sat at a desk, or we're, stuck in our houses at the moment, accumulating stress, and we're not getting to get rid of it and expel the stress hormones in our system. So if you can put some music on and just dance it out, Taylor Swift was onto something with her song Shake It Out. That can be really helpful. So what else can you do? Another simple thing is breathing. Deep, slow breaths down-regulate our stress response, especially when the breath out is long and slow and it goes all the way to you under your breath. So perhaps think about, if you're sitting at your desk throughout the day, what are ways that you can use your breath at like micro moments, perhaps counting in for a breath of 4 and breathing out for a count of 6, so slightly longer out breath. And that's something we can constantly come to. It's constantly available to us to help reset our system. Another thing is social connection. When we're stressed, we often want to be left alone, and I know I'm somebody that retreats when I'm feeling stressed. But actually, we're built for social connection, and mammals, we've evolved to make and maintain that social bond. So I know this can be difficult in a lockdown situation, but it's about finding ways. So is it a Zoom call, a telephone call, just to connect to somebody, because that in itself calms our nervous system. Another thing is sleep, and it's a difficult one to talk about when we're mums, because sometimes our sleep is so compromised and we might not have full control over it. I know I've got a 2.5-year-old who's only just started to sleep through the night. So when people would talk to me about sleep, I'd go, but don't you understand? So the reason why sleep is so important is particularly REM sleep. It's our body's natural way of processing unresolved stress that we've accumulated throughout the day. And if you're like me, my natural tendency when I've had a difficult day and I maybe even not got my work done is to push through. Kind of my strong will and conscientiousness kicks in. So I might put the kids to bed in lockdown and work later to get my work done. But actually that sleep is so important for our resilience and for resetting our stress system. And my mum was onto something when I was little. She always used to say to me, a good night's sleep solves everything. And I used to roll my eyes at her. But it is such a foundational pillar for our health. We used to think that sleep was one of the pillars of good health, but we now realise it's the foundation piece that everything else is built upon. So if you're feeling like you're burning out at the moment, replenishment and rest is fundamental. It's the starting place for this. Also, having a good cry, it's our body's way of reducing stress. It eliminates our stress hormones, it lowers our blood pressure, and it's a way of being in touch with our emotions and processing them. And there's two neuroscientists that wrote a book called The Mystery of Tears, and it's all about the kind of neuroscience behind crying. I think the important thing to say here is it's not your fault if you're feeling burned out. You know, we're in an impossible situation at the moment, and we've been under pressure probably since becoming mums, let alone in a pandemic. But it is your responsibility to take charge of this, to stop yourself burning out. It is your responsibility to reset your system, because without that intermittent recovery, we're not going to be able to sustain our positive emotions. Our fight, flight and freeze can get really easily triggered, and it drains our energy and causes friction, like in our relationships. And it reduces our cognitive capability, so we're not able to perform as well as we'd like to be. So we become less productive, and then it becomes this kind of negative downward spiral. So I hope these insights into what is burnout, what are the 5 red flags, and what are some of the simple micro steps that you can take to help reset your system so that you don't get dragged onto that path of burnout. And I love this quote by Owen Thomas that says, and every day the world will drag you by the hand yelling, this is important, and this is important, and this is important. You need to worry about this, and this, and this. And each day it's up to you to yank your hand back and put it on your heart and say, no, this is what is important. And it always makes me kind of get a little bit kind of emotional when I say that, because the world is pulling us in so many different directions at the moment as working mums. That, you know, the home learning is important, our jobs are important, the domestic load is important. And actually, if we don't put our hands back on our heart and connect to our body and go, no, the most important thing is my health, because without that, I can't do anything. I can't support my family. I can't be the kind of emotional shouldering for what's going on at the moment. So I just encourage you, I hope this episode has given you some kind of ideas about how you can do that. And as always, I'd love to hear from you. Has this been useful? Has it been interesting? What are you taking from it? What are you going to do as a result of listening to it? So drop me an email, tag me on social media, or head over to iTunes or your favourite podcast platform and let me know there. But if you'd like the support of nearly 30 other inspirational women to help you to not burn out this year, I want you to check this out. I've created the Thrive Summit, and it's an online resource for working mums that covers the areas of wellbeing, lifestyle, relationships, career, business, wealth, and mindset. And in this resource, it's pre-recorded sessions that you can listen to at your convenience, in your pajamas at home if you wish. And each session is jam-packed with insights to help you feel supported, replenished and inspired this year. And it launched a couple of weeks ago, and the feedback that I'm getting from women that have participated in this is been incredible. Honestly, it is such a useful resource. And if you're interested in learning more about it, I urge you to head over to wisdom4workingmums.co.uk/thrive. So that's wisdom for FOR working mums, mums.co.uk/thrive. And it could just be the support you need this year to help you to not hit that burnout. There's interviews and insights from experts that I've mentioned on this podcast today that helped me with my recovery, but also the women that I wish that I'd had access to that would have stopped me from burning out. And I've put it together so that you could have the support that you need. Plus, if you buy a ticket, 50% of your ticket price goes to charity. I've 3 amazing charities that I support through my work. Winston's Wish, which are a child bereavement charity, The Haven, who are a women's refuge in my local area, and Homestart UK, which go into the homes of families with young children and give them the support that they really need. So by helping yourself, you'll also be helping these 3 amazing charities. So head over to wisdom4workingmums.co.uk/thrive for more details. As always, thanks for listening, and until next time, take care. If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, please share it on social media and with your friends and family. I'd love to connect with you too, so if you head over to wisdom4workingmums.co.uk, you'll find a link on how to do this. And if you love the show and really want to support it, please go to iTunes, write a review and subscribe. You'll be helping another working mum find this resource too. Thanks so much for listening.